Remember that we talk about opportunity cost, production possibility frontier, positive and normative analysis. And I also talked about different kinds of pictures, right? I talked about bar chart or pie chart, and more importantly, the chart for two related variables. And then I talked about demand curve. Basically, we have finished the little section on individual demand curve. So we talk about quantity demanded and law of demand. And then importantly, you guys have to be sure that you understand the difference between demand and quantity demanded. So in today's lecture, let's continue to talk about demand. Well, basically we have talked about market demand. Basically we have talked about individual demand. However, if you're thinking about a market, you have to talk about market demand, right? So now the question is, how do we go from individual demand to market demand? Well, this is actually pretty simple. So market demand is defined as the sum of all the individual demands, right? So basically, if you add up all the buyers' demand curves, then you will get the demand curve for the market. So now let's see a very simple example with just two buyers, right? So the first buyer is called Catherine. The second buyer is called Nicholas. So we have their demand curve, right? So this is Catherine's demand curve. And then this is Nicholas' demand curve. So how do we get the market demand? If we assume the market only has two buyers, in this case, we could just add up Catherine's demand and Nicholas's demand, and then we could get market demand. But how do you add up different buyers' demand? Well, what you need to do here is you need to look at each price. So let's say at price 0, Catherine's quantity demanded is 12, and Nicholas's quantity demanded is 7. Clearly, this implies the quantity demanded by the market is 19, right? So by the same reasoning, at the price of 50 cents, Catherine's quantity demanded is 10, and Nicholas's quantity demanded is 6. So the total, that is, the quantity demanded by the market is 16. So what kind of conclusion you can have here? Well, basically, if you wanted to go from individual demands to the market demand, what you're going to do is you just add up each individual's quantity demanded at each price. This will give you market demand, right? For this slide, we're basically thinking about market demand from or based on numbers. So now let's think about market demand based on pictures, right? We have 3 little pictures here. So this one basically draws out Catherine's demand. Again, how do you draw this demand curve? It's pretty simple, right? Because basically you have these numbers and you have these prices. So if you draw these prices on the horizontal axis, and if you draw these numbers on the vertical axis, right, you will have the demand curve you want. So basically, this is Catherine's demand. And we could also find out, or we could also draw out Nicholas's demand. Now, how do you get market demand? Well, let's look at the price of $2 at price of $2. Catherine's demand is 4, and Nicholas's quantity demanded is 3. So this implies at the price of 2, the quantity demanded by the market is 7, right? So we should draw a point here. We could do the same thing for other different prices. I mean, by adding up quantity demanded of these two consumers. So in the end, we will get the market demand curve. Now, to summarize, basically, if you have the demand curve for Catherine and the demand curve for Nicholas, to get the market demand, what you're going to do is you basically add horizontally, right? Add horizontally individual demand curves. So you can imagine that this is Catherine's demand curve, and this is Nicholas's demand curve. If you add up these curves horizontally, you will get a curve which looks like this, right? So you will get a curve which looks like this. So this is basically the market demand, right? Okay, now let's talk about the important topics of shifts in the demand curve. Later, you will also learn about shifts in the supply curve. Here, the keyword is shifts, right? We want to examine what kind of factors, what kind of forces can shift the demand curve. By the way, because we're talking about shifts in the demand curve, you have to see that because demand is not the same as quantity demanded. So change in demand is different from change in quantity demanded. Basically, change in demand means there is some shift in the demand curve. Change in quantity demanded basically means there is a change in the quantity, right? There is some change in the numbers, right? Okay, the first factor, the first force which could shift the demand curve is income, right? So depending on what kind of good you're having, income could actually increase demand or decrease demand. For example, if we are talking about normal good, then more income implies higher demand. And if we are talking about inferior good, then more income implies lower demand. You might want to ask, so what is a normal good and what is an inferior good? Well, interestingly, these two goods are defined according to how your demand will respond to income changes. So you can see here, normal good is a good for which other things equal, an increase in income leads to an increase in demand. Then inferior good is surely the other case. That is, if a good for which other things equal, an increase in income leads to a decrease in demand, then this good is a inferior good. Now, let's see. Okay, first, can you think about some examples about normal goods? It should be easy, right? You could actually imagine that most goods are normal goods because when you have higher income, generally you would want to buy more, right? So just think about any examples which could fit into this definition of normal good. Well, maybe you could say a fancy restaurant meal, right? If you have more money, potentially you could dine out more, right? You could eat more fancy meals, right? right? So this could be an example of a normal good. Now, what are the examples of inferior goods? So here I have two examples for you. So first, you could think about some goods sold at Dollar Tree, right? So these are very cheap goods, right? I would say most likely their quality is, they generally don't have the highest quality, and their price are generally quite low. You can imagine that if you, let's say, if you have a income of $10,000 per year, well, maybe you would want to shop at Dollar Tree. But let's say from a certain year, right, you become lucky. Your income will become $1 million per year. Well, most likely you will not shop at Dollar Tree anymore, right? So here, goods sold at Dollar Tree could be candidates for inferior good. Now, the second example is some super cheap, unsafe old cars, let's say 20-year-old cars with over 100K miles, right? Generally, if you're 16 years old, right, and if this is your first car, well, you could buy a very old car. But if you're 38 years old, right, let's say you have somewhat established yourself with, let's say, fairly high income, then in this case, it's possible you will not buy a used car, right? Instead, you could buy a new car. So in this case, you can see that this super cheap, unsafe old car could be the candidates for inferior goods. And I have to say that whether a good is inferior or normal, it somewhat also depends on your taste, right? For example, you just really like unsafe, super cheap cars. In this case, no matter what is your income level, you could potentially always buy a super cheap old cars, right? Of course, these are just very peculiar cases. Generally, right, most of the time, you could consider these two examples as examples of inferior goods. Oh, by the way, I think I forgot to mention shift in the demand curve, right? So I guess first I should talk about shift. Let me utilize this blank space to talk about shift in demand curve. So you can see that this is a demand curve, right? Remember, to draw a demand curve, you would want to draw quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. Now, let's think about a shift. Now, let's say I want to shift this demand curve to the right. So, in this case, I want to ask you, if you're shifting to the demand curve, are you increasing your demand or decreasing your demand, right? So the question is, are you increase or decrease your demand, right? Well, the answer is, if you shift your demand curve to the right, then you're increasing your demand. Why? Why this is the case? I know, if you know this, it's actually very easy to understand this. But if you don't know this, let me explain this to you. You could draw a dashed line like this, right? So let's say this is $10. So the price is $10. Now, before the shift, let's say your quantity demanded is, let's say 2, right? 2 apples, 2 oranges, whatever. Now, what about this point? I don't know the exact number, but you can be sure that this quantity demanded has to be larger than 2, right? So let's say we just put a number here. Let's say it's 5. So this tells you that at any price, quantity demanded on this demand curve. Let's call this as D prime, right? So let me repeat this. So at any price, quantity demanded on D prime is larger than quantity demanded on demand curve D, right? I mean, this is for the price of $10. Obviously, you could try other prices, right? Let's say you're trying the price of $5. Again, right, you can see that on this demand curve D star, on this demand curve D prime, we are looking at this point. And on this demand curve D, we are looking at this point. So again, you can see that quantity demanded on this D prime curve is larger compared with the quantity demanded from the demand curve D, right? So what's the lesson here? The lesson here is if you shift the demand curve to the right, you're increasing your demand. Obviously, if you're shifting your demand curve to the left, you're decreasing your demand, right? Okay, now let's continue to talk about the second force. So the first force moving or shifting the demand curve is income. And the second force is prices of related goods. Here, we could have two kinds of related goods. The first one is called substitute, right? So, what are substitute goods? So, if you have two goods, and if there is an increase in the price of one good, then this increase in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for the other good. Then, we say these two goods are substitutes to each other. Now, what about complements? Well, if you have two goods, right? If an increase in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other good, then these goods are complements. Now, let's see some example here, right? So, substitutes, right? So, margarine and butter, they're substitutes, right? Margarine is basically man-made butter, right? And tea and in coffee, they are substitutes, right? At least for some people. And orange and apple, they're substitutes, right? Now, what are the examples of complements? Well, you can see that pencils and erasers, they're complements, right? Because you would always use pencils and erasers together. Now, the second example is hot dogs and hot dog buns, right? Because generally you would pair hot dog buns with hot dogs. You generally wouldn't just eat hot dog buns. That would be incredibly boring, right? And the third example is tea and sugar. Again, depending on culture, right? If you're from the UK, potentially you would drink tea with sugar. But if you're from most part of China, then you would not drink tea with sugar, right? So, of course, these examples, sometimes they depend on exact situations, right, or cultures. Okay, anyway, so now let's think why, okay, let's say, okay, let me figure out which example I want to use here. Okay, I use orange and apple. Let's see why these are substitutes according to the definition, right? Remember, by the definition, if there is an increase in the price of one good, then there should be an increase in the demand for the other, right? If these two goods are substitutes. Now, let's think about orange and apple. Well, let's say the price of orange increases, right? So let's say the price of orange increases. Now, as a consumer, your first response is, okay, now orange is more expensive. And for me, apple can be used to substitute orange. And in the case that orange becomes more expensive, I would be happier to buy fewer oranges and I will buy more apple, right? So you can see that demand for apple increases. This actually fits into the definition of substitutes, right? Now, let's look at complements. Let's say, okay, I will use tea and sugar. Now, let's say tea becomes more expensive, right? So the price of tea increases. And if a person who drinks tea and sugar together, now you will drink less tea, right? As you drink less tea, you will buy less sugar. So now the demand for sugar decreases, right? So you can see that again, this tea and sugar example fits into the definition of complements. Okay, let's see other factors which could shift the demand curve. First, tastes, right? This is obvious. Let's say you like drinking tea, but someday you become tired of tea, right? You don't want tea anymore. Now, in this case, there is a change in your taste for tea, and the demand for tea will also change. Now, expectations. So, let's say again, you're a tea drinker, and you expect in 2 months, the price of tea will increase. Now, if you expect the price of tea will increase, as a rational person, what you would want to do is you want to buy more tea today, right? So this will increase your demand for tea. Again, to summarize, if you expect the tea price to increase, your demand for tea today will increase. Now, number of buyers, well, this is even simpler. You can imagine that in a market, if number of buyers decreases, right, then market demand will also decrease. Okay, so this is the graph about shifts in the demand curve. So let me emphasize this, right? Of course, I have talked about this. That is, if you're moving the demand curve to the right, right, to the right, then there is an increase in the demand. And if you're moving the demand curve to the left, then there is a decrease in demand. Okay, now let's see an example here. Now, so let's say we wanted to look for factors which generate a decrease in demand. So we wanted to see what factors would generate this, right? A shift of demand curve to the left. Now, we have all these possible reasons. First, people's income fall. Well, we know that if you, let's assume ice cream is a normal good, right? So in this case, we know that by definition, right? By the definition of a normal good, if your income decreases, then your demand will decrease. In this case, it means demand curve will shift to the left. Now, let's say, let's move to the second reason. Let's say Canadian Medical Association finds that consuming 1 ice cream cone per day increases death rate by 10%. So what's this? So what is this about, right? This is about taste, right? So after reading this research, your fondness to ice cream decreases, right? So in this case, your taste changes. And because of the change in your taste, there will be a shift in the demand curve, right? In this case, because your fondness to ice cream decreases, the demand curve for ice cream moves to the left. By the way, of course, for the first case, the factor is income. Okay, now let's see the third factor, right? The price of ice cream cone is expected to fall. So this is about expectation, right? So in this case, if you expect the price of ice cream cone to fall, then just imagine this is yourself. What would you want to do? It's possible that you will buy fewer ice cream cones, right? Because you expect in the future ice cream cones will be cheaper, right? So you could wait and you will reduce today's consumption. So again, in this case, demand for ice cream would shift to the left. And then let's look at the fourth factor. The number of ice cream cone buyers decrease. Well, this is about number of buyers, right? So this is about number of buyers. Obviously, if you have fewer buyers in the market, then the market demand will decrease. So market demand will shift to the left. Next, the price of frozen yogurt. Let's see what's the relationship between ice cream and frozen yogurt. Well, most likely they're substitutes, right? So they're substitutes, right? So you can see that if the price of frozen yogurt decreases, it means people would want more frozen yogurt. And this implies if they're substitutes, then people will buy less ice cream. So in this case, demand curve for ice cream shifts to the left. Now, this case, the last case, the price of brownie increases. So what's the relationship between ice cream and brownie? Well, most likely they're complements, right? So you would eat some brownie, then you would eat some ice cream. So in this case, if brownie becomes more expensive, you will buy fewer brownie, and then you will buy fewer ice cream cones. So the demand for ice cream decreases. In this case, the demand curve for ice cream would shift to the left. Of course, you could do the exercise and see what kind of factors would move to the demand curve to the right. This is easy, right? For example, in the first case, in this case, if you change people's incomes fall to people's incomes increase, then you will observe the demand curve should shift to the right, right? Okay, now let's summarize. So when we're talking about shifts of the demand curve, there are several factors, right? So we have income as a factor. And in this case, you have to be sure whether it's an inferior good or it is a normal good. And then we have prices of related goods. So in this case, if we are thinking about the prices of related goods, you have to be careful whether this is a substitutes or these goods are complements. And then there's also this factor of tastes, right? So if your taste changes, then your demand should change. Then there's also the factor of expectation and number of buyers. Importantly, you have to understand the first row, right? If there's a change in the price of the good itself, then there will be no shift in the demand curve. And to be more specific, you will observe a movement along the demand curve. So why this is the case? Well, if you think about the construction of a demand curve, then on the vertical axis, you get price. And on the horizontal axis, you get quantity, right? So let's say this is your demand curve. Now, if the price of the good itself changes, let's say price decreases, right? Price decreases. Now, what you're gonna do is you should move along this curve, right? You should move along this curve. So basically, to summarize, there are two cases, right? The first case is about the price of the good itself. And then the second case is about different factors which shift the demand curve. Obviously, in your exercise, you have to be careful, right? You have to check whether it's about the price of the good or it's about the price of related goods, right? I mean, this and this, right? So for price of the good, move along the demand curve. For prices of related goods, you would shift the demand curve. Now let's see the example here. So for demand curve for music downloads, what happens to it in each of the following scenarios? So we have basically three cases here, right? So the first case is the price of iPhone falls. Now, think about the relationship between music downloads and iPhone, right? I would say they're complements, right? So in this case, if the price of iPhone falls, then according to the definition, right, the music download, the demand for music download should increase, right? Of course, you could also think about this in several different steps. First step, price of iPhone falls. This means quantity demanded for iPhone should decrease. Second step, iPhone and music downloads are complements. In this case, if there are fewer iPhones in the market, then there should be there should be fewer music downloads, right? So, let me correct my mistake. So basically, if the price of iPhone falls, then the quantity demanded for iPhone increases, right? So if there are more iPhones in the market, there should be more music downloads, which means the demand for music downloads actually increases. So you can see that it's easy to make mistakes, right? Okay, the second case, the price of music downloads falls. Now, in this case, you can see that we are talking about music downloads. And now the price of music downloads falls. So what we should observe here is a movement along the demand curve, right? To be more specific, if the price of music downloads falls, then quantity demanded for music downloads should what? Should increase, right? So we should observe a movement. That is, we should move along this demand curve. Now, the third case, the price of CDs falls. I know most likely these days nobody listens to CDs anymore, but still, let's pretend there are some people who like this old formats, so they actually listen to CDs. So in this case, you can see that music downloads and CDs are actually what? Supplements, right? So in this case, if price of CDs fall, then people will want to buy more CDs. And because CDs and music downloads are substitutes, so as people buy more CDs, they will reduce their consumption of music downloads. So in this case, the demand for music downloads decreases, right? Clearly, you need to be able to solve problems like this. And you can see that the key to solve these problems is you have to understand first the difference between moving along the demand curve and shifting the demand curve. Second, you need to be familiar with those different factors which could shift the demand curve, and you also need to understand to what direction this demand curve will shift to, right? Okay, after talking about demand, now we could talk about supply. The market has two sides. So to understand market equilibrium, we have to understand both demand and supply. Okay. Well, since we have learned about demand curve, so it's much easier to talk about supply curve. So first, we also, just like what we have down in the demand section. So in this section of supply curve, let's first define several concepts. The first one is quantity supplied, right? So the quantity supplied is the amount of a product that sellers are willing and able to sell. You can see that this is like the opposite type of definition compared with quantity demanded, right? Because quantity demanded is the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to buy. Now, law of supply, it says that other things equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. You can see that we have learned about law of demand, right? Law of demand says other things equal, the quantity demanded decreases when the price increases. Now, supply schedule. So supply schedule is basically a table that shows you the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity supplied. Again, you can compare this with demand schedule, right? Demand schedule is also a table. However, it gives you the relationship between the price and quantity demanded. Now, supply curve. So supply curve is a picture which tells you the relationship between the price of the product and the quantity supplied. Again, what is a demand curve? Demand curve is essentially a picture which tells you the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. Okay, now let's look at Ben's supply schedule and supply curve. So here you can see that if the price is 0, Ben will supply 0. If the price is $1.5, Ben will supply 2 ice cream cones. So you can see that we could basically draw this table, right? So let's say if the price is 1, let's look at this. Then quantity supplied is 1, so we get this point. And if the price is 1.5, then quantity supplied is 2. So by the same steps, right, we could draw out all these dots. And then we connect these dots. And this gives us the and this gives us the supply curve. Clearly, you can see that we're only talking about a simple case here. That is, we're only thinking about this straight line, right? This supply curve is a very simple straight line. In reality, the supply curve could be curved, right? However, we just want to deal with the simplest case. Okay, so let's think about market supply. Obviously, market supply is just the sum of supplies from all sellers, right? So you could just add up all sellers' quantity supplied. Then you will get quantity supplied by the market. Let's see how this exactly works. So let's say we have two sellers. We have Ben and Jerry. And now we have the quantity supplied for Ben and Jerry. So let's say we want to find out what is the quantity supplied by the market if the price is 1.5. Well, we could see that the quantity supplied by Ben is 2 and the quantity supplied by Jerry is 2. So this tells us the quantity supplied by the market is 4. Of course, here we assume the market has only two sellers, just Ben and Jerry. Right? So basically this is how mathematically you could find out the market supply curve. So now let's see how could you solve this using pictures. So let's say this is Ben's supply. This is Jerry's supply. And we would want to find out market supply. So here, market supply, well, we have talked about this, is the sum of two supplies, right? Graphically, it means you want to add up these two supplies horizontally, right? Horizontally. So, to be more specific, you can see that at the price of 2, if the quantity of the ice cream cone is 3, and for Jerry, the quantity is 4, so for the market, it should be 7, right? It means it should be here. Right? So basically, your market supply curve would be like this. Okay, let's think about shifts in the supply curve. Well, we have talked about shifts in the demand curve. So we actually have some experiences thinking about shifts, right? Of course, at this time, we're dealing with the supply curve. So let's see what kind of factors we have here. So we focus on 4 different kinds of factors which could shift the supply curve, right? So we are focusing on input prices, technology, expectations, and number of sellers. Let's see if I have, okay, we have a example here. So let's first talk about the shifts in the supply curve. Now, you can see that in this case, if you shift the supply curve to the right, right? You're shifting to the right. In this case, you're increasing your supply, right? This is somewhat confusing because you can see that supply curve S2, right, is lower compared with supply curve S1, right? It seems as if you have lower supply on supply curve S2. It's not the case, right? S2 has higher supply. Why? Well, we could do the same thing as we have done for demand curve. So let's say we're looking at the price of $10. Now, if the price is $10, what you would see here is let's say on this blue curve, let me write down some random quantity. Let's say it's 5, right? Now, what is the quantity supplied on this brown curve, on this curve S2? Well, let's say it is 8. Clearly, you can see that at the same price, suppliers on the supply curve S2 supply more compared with suppliers on the supply curve S1, right? Now, let's look at supply curve S3, right? So if you move the supply curve to the left, you will have supply curve S3. Well, we have understood demand is larger for supply curve S2. Then obviously demand is smaller for supply curve S3. So basically the conclusion here is if you move supply curve to the right, you will get higher supply. And if you move supply curve to the left, you will get lower supply. Now let's look at this example and understand how input, expectation, and technology and number of sellers could affect the supply curve. So let's say we're thinking about this supply curve, S3, right? To obtain S3, you basically have to shift supply curve S1 to the left. So here, let's see what kind of factors would generate a shift or a left shift of the supply curve. Okay, the first one is an increase in the price of milk. So this is the change in the input price, right? In this case, it means that input becomes more expensive. So in this case, as a seller, right, you will want to charge a higher price. This implies your demand will decrease. Why this is the case? Well, if you look at this quantity, let's say this is 3, then you can see that sellers on this supply curve S3, they charge higher price compared with sellers on this original blue supply curve, right? So that's why an increase in input price will generate a decrease in the supply curve. Now, the second, technology in making ice cream becomes worse, right? So here, you could imagine that because technology becomes worse, then it is more expensive to make ice creams, right? So again, you will get this S3 demand curve. Now, let's talk about the third factor. The third factor says the price of ice cream is expected to rise. Now, think about this from the perspective of an ice cream seller. If you're the seller, and if you know ice cream will become more expensive in the next month, what would you do? Well, if you know the ice cream cones will be more expensive in the future, you will want to reduce your supply today, right? Because why would you want to sell at a lower price, right? Okay, let's see the fourth factor. Number of ice cream sellers decrease. Well, this is easy to understand, right? Fewer sellers in the market, smaller demand. Okay. Again, we have the movement along the supply curve. Remember that in the case of demand curve, if there is a change in the price of the product itself, then you will observe a movement along the demand curve. So here for supply curve, the idea is the same, right? In this example of ice cream supply curve, if the price of ice cream changes, then we will observe a movement along the supply curve. So to be more specific, in this case, if the price of ice cream increases, then the quantity supplied will increase. And you will move upward along the supply curve. To be more specific, let me draw this. To be more specific, let's say if the ice cream price originally was $5 and in the end it increases to $10, then you will move along this curve, right? Okay, let's summarize. So basically, input prices, technology, and expectations, and number of sellers would shift the demand curve, right? The other case is the price of the product itself, right? If there's a change in the price of the good itself, then it represents a movement along the supply curve. Okay, now let's see this quick quiz. It says, make up an example of a monthly supply schedule for pizza and graph the implied supply curve. And then give an example of something that would shift this supply curve. The third question is about, would a change in the price of the pizza shift this supply curve? Well, this is easy, right? Because we have done this ice cream cone supply curve example. So it's basically the same for pizza. Okay, now the first problem says make up a example of a monthly supply schedule for pizza. Right? Okay, let's say we start from a supply schedule. And it's a supply schedule, so we need two things, price and quantity. Okay, now let's say we're talking about 9-inch pizza, right? Let's say if the 9-inch pizza is, let's say it's $0. As a seller, you won't sell anything, right? Let's say if it's $4, you would be happy to sell one. And then let's say if it's $8, you would be happy to sell two, right? Again, if it's 12, you would be happy to sell 3. So this is your supply schedule. Now, according to this supply schedule, you could draw out your supply curve. So this is quantity, and you have the price here. So 0, 0. And if price is, okay, we have 4, 8, 12. Now the quantity could be 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So if price is 4, then quantity is 1. Price is 8, quantity is 2. Price is 12, quantity is 3. So we could connect these dots. We get a straight line supply curve. Now what's the next question? It says, give an example of something that would shift this supply curve. Now, well, there could be a lot of factors, at least 4 factors which could shift the supply curve. So let's say, there could be a lot of factors which could shift this supply curve. Let's say flour, right? Because you need flour to make pizza. So let's say flour becomes more expensive. So in this case, flour is a kind of input. And we have learned if input price increases, supply curve should move to the left, right? So let's say this is the first supply curve. The second supply curve is called S prime. Now, would a change in the price of a pizza shift this supply curve? Well, we're talking about a change in the price of pizza, right? If the price of pizza changes, we should move along the supply curve. Let's say if the price of pizza increases, then we should move along this supply curve, right? Okay, now let's talk about the ultimate topic of this chapter, supply and demand together, right? And obviously, we want to understand the competitive market. To be more specific, we want to understand the competitive market equilibrium. So to do this, we basically have to consider supply and demand together, right? Now, let's first define equilibrium. As I said, we are interested in market equilibrium. So a market equilibrium is a situation in which quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Now, if the market is in equilibrium, we have two kinds of equilibrium objects. The first one is equilibrium price. The second one is equilibrium quantity. So the equilibrium price is the price that balances quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Basically, it means at the equilibrium price, quantity supplied should be equal to quantity demanded. Equilibrium quantity is essentially the quantity supplied or the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. Well, equilibrium quantity can be either quantity supplied or quantity demanded because in equilibrium, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So these two numbers, these two quantities are the same. Graphically, it's fairly simple to understand market equilibrium. So here you can see that we're talking about the market equilibrium of the ice cream cones. Now we have the supply curve, right? And we also have the demand curve. So how do you get market equilibrium from this simple graph? Well, market equilibrium is given by the intersection of these two lines, right? That is, the intersection of the supply curve and demand curve gives you the market equilibrium, right? So here, this red dot gives you the market equilibrium. As I said, at the market equilibrium, you can talk about equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, right? You can see that you can get the equilibrium price, which is 2 here. And then you could also get the equilibrium quantity, which is 7 here. That is, at the equilibrium price of $2, the quantity supplied for ice cream cones is 7. And the quantity demanded for ice cream cones is also 7. So the market is in equilibrium. Now let's think about the case when the market is not in equilibrium, right? If the market is not in equilibrium, there are two cases. The first case is surplus. The second case is shortage. So if the quantity supplied is larger compared with the quantity demanded, then the market is in surplus. And if the quantity demanded is larger than quantities supplied, then there is a shortage in the market. So let's analyze these two pictures. For graph A, we have surplus. Now, you can see that the market equilibrium price is $2. However, if we are looking at the price of 2.5, then you can see that this is a higher price, which is higher compared with the market equilibrium price. So in this case, you can see that the quantity supplied is given by 10, and the quantity demanded is given by 4. So there is a surplus of 3, which is 10 minus, So there is a surplus of 6, which is 10 minus 4. Now, let's look at the picture on the right-hand side, right? Picture B here. So we are looking at the price 1.5 here. It's a price lower than $2, right? It is lower than the market equilibrium price. And now I can see that from the demand curve, the quantity demanded is 10. And the quantity supplied is 4. So here, quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. So we have a shortage of what? Of 6, right? 10 minus 4. So what kind of conclusion you can draw here? Well, basically, the conclusion is if the market price is larger than the equilibrium price, there will be surplus. If the market price is too low, that is, if it is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be shortage, right? I mean, intuitively, this makes sense, right? If the price is higher than the equilibrium price, the price is too high. Buyers just don't want to buy your products. And a lot of sellers will be happy to sell at a high price. So this will create surplus, right? Then shortage is also very easy to understand. If the price is too low, if it's lower than the market equilibrium price, then buyers will be very happy. A lot of buyers will want to buy the product, right? However, due to this low price, sellers are not happy. They will not want to sell. So you can see that there will be shortage, right? Now, let's think how the market can restore to equilibrium if there is surplus or shortage. Now, let's say if there is surplus in the market, right? What happens? What will happen, right? Well, think about this. There is a surplus of 6 units in the market. And basically this says a lot of sellers will want to sell, but there are not enough buyers. You can imagine that in the case of surplus, these sellers, they will compete for buyers. What they would do is they will cut their prices. So this competition force will actually drive down the price to the equilibrium level, right? So it will pull the price of 2.5 down to the market equilibrium of $2. Now, the same kind of argument can be made for this shortage case. Let's say if there is this shortage in the market, basically it means that a lot of buyers would want to buy the product, but there are not enough sellers. Now you can imagine what would happen, right? Sellers would be happy to raise their prices. So in this case, you can see that this low price of $15 will be put up, right? Will be put up to the $2 equilibrium price. So you can see that the competition force, at least in the competitive market, will actually eliminate either surplus or shortage, will actually put the market back into equilibrium, right? You can see here we have several slides, and these slides talk about surplus, shortage. Basically, I have talked about these things using these two pictures. So I will just skip these different slides here. Okay, now let's talk about law of supply and demand. It is a claim that the price of any good will adjust to bring the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded for that good into balance. We basically have talked about this, right? Because we said, well, the market could be well, it's possible the market is not in equilibrium. There could be surplus or shortage. However, the competition force will put the market back into equilibrium. So this is essentially law of supply and demand. Okay, let me see if I have enough time for this. Okay, we could just finish one example. So now let's do several exercises, right? To understand how could we analyze changes in the market equilibrium. And the textbook gives you this formula, which is a three-step process to understand changes in market equilibrium. So you can see that the first step is, generally you will see some event. So the first step is you want to decide whether this event will affect supply or demand, or both. And then you will decide which direction the curve will shift. And third, you will use the supply and demand picture to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and quantity. I mean, for me, I don't exactly follow this three-step process. I guess I'm more familiar with these changes, right? This type of analysis. So for you, as a beginner, maybe it's a good idea to follow this three-step process. Okay, let's see the first example. So let's say there's a change in, let's see. So the story is about one summer, the weather is very hot. And we want to understand how this event will affect the market for ice cream, right? So basically, now remember the three-step process, right? Now we're talking about hot weather. Now, think about this. Should this affect supply curve? I don't think so, right? Now, should this affect demand curve? Well, it's clear this should affect demand curve, right? As a consumer, if the weather is very hot, then it's very likely you will buy more ice cream cones, right? So now we have finished the first step and the second step because we know that first, this will affect demand curve. Second, we know that because of the hot weather, you will buy more ice cream cones. So the demand for ice cream cones should increase, right? The third step says you should use the supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and quantity, right? Okay, now let's see. Okay, now you're having this analysis here. So, okay, let me do this on the lecture note. Oops, I don't have any space here. Okay, this is bad. Okay, now let's say this is the market for ice cream, right? So this is the quantity, this is the price. First step, we shifted the demand curve. And second, we know we should shift the demand curve to the right because demand is increasing because of the hot weather. So D becomes D prime, right? D becomes D prime. We shift to the right. Now, after the shift, what is the change in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity? Well, you can see that this is your supply curve. Initially, the market equilibrium was here, right? Let's call this point A. And because of the hot weather, we have a different market equilibrium of point B. Now, just to compare A and B, you can see two things, right? So basically, the price of the ice cream cones will increase, and the quantity demanded for ice cream cones will also increase. This does make sense, right? If weather is so hot, of course, potentially the price of ice cream cones should increase, and people consume more ice cream cones, so the quantity demand should increase, right? Okay, you can see that this slides gives you this detailed three-step process, right? And we have some numbers here. You can see that in the beginning, the equilibrium price was 2 and equilibrium quantity was 7. And in new equilibrium, higher price 2.5, higher quantity of 10. Okay, that's for today's class.